before the Vikings became legends, before the longships darkened the shores of Christian Europe, there was a silence, a chilling silence buried beneath the sands of the Baltic Sea. No sagas spoke of them, no monk recorded their names, and yet in a forgotten grave on the Estonian coast, the bones of 40 warriors whispered the truth, that the age of the Vikings didn't begin with glory. It began with desperation, with blood, with fire. This is not the story you were taught in school. This is the raw, unfiltered origin of the most feared seafarers in history, the true beginning, where survival forged savagery, and where the first Viking sails rose not in conquest, but in hunger. Welcome to the dark birth of the Viking Age. They weren't supposed to be there, not in Estonia, not in that century, and certainly not buried like kings. When archaeologists first uncovered the two ships half submerged in the coastal soil of Saaremaa Island, they expected another humble relic of ancient maritime travel. What they found instead was a mass grave. Inside the warped timbers lay bones, dozens of them, stacked and arranged with deliberate care, not scattered, not abandoned, but honored. Positioned as if in death, these warriors were meant to sail once more. There were 40 men in total, buried across two ships. Their skeletons told a tale that no saga had ever sung. A sword strike had punched a perfect square into one man's skull, a wound so clean, so precise, it could have been made yesterday. Another's forearms bore deep gashes, classic defensive wounds, as if he'd raised his hands one last time before the blade found his neck. And one man was missing his head entirely. His vertebrae bore the cruel, unmistakable cut of decapitation. This wasn't a funeral, it was an aftermath. And yet, it wasn't chaos. These men were not left in haste, they were buried with intention. Swords still clenched in skeletal hands, shields placed over their chests, fragments of clothing, tools, even gaming pieces, little touches of humanity, of life before the final clash. But who were they? The soil itself provided part of the answer. Carbon dating revealed the shocking truth. These men died around 750 AD. That's nearly half a century before the infamous raid on Lindisfarne in 793, the event many believe marked the dawn of the Viking Age. But these weren't monks or farmers. These were trained warriors. They bore Scandinavian weapons, were buried with Scandinavian customs, and had died far from home. So what were they doing here, on the wrong side of the Baltic Sea, decades before Viking became a word of fear? The answer is as haunting as the grave itself. These men were the first of their kind. Proto-Vikings, the forgotten vanguard, not raiders yet, not conquerors, but the spark that would ignite a firestorm across medieval Europe. And it all began here, in the sand. Imagine it, a cold gray sky pressing down on unfamiliar shores. 40 men, hungry, determined, uncertain, stepping onto a foreign land with little more than their weapons and their will. Perhaps they came to trade, perhaps to explore, or perhaps even then something darker stirred beneath their mission. We don't know what went wrong, but something did. But something did. Something violent. Something final. Archaeological patterns suggest they fought a battle, a brutal, close-quarters fight. The wounds weren't from arrows at a distance. These were blade on bone, man to man, eye to eye. And when it was over, only a dozen remained to bury the dead. Can you picture it? Thorgrim the Old. Maybe a grizzled veteran who had seen too many winters, standing on that foreign shore, giving orders through gritted teeth. The survivors, bruised and bloodied, dragging their fallen brothers into the hulls of ships that would never sail again, piling bodies by rank and kinship, placing swords beside hands that could no longer wield them, whispering prayers to Odin or to ancestors as they laid down shield after shield like wooden gravestones. They must have known how dangerous it was to linger. They were deep in enemy territory, but they didn't flee. They buried them. That act alone tells us something profound. These were not reckless pirates. They had rules, rituals, brotherhood, a code of honor rooted in something ancient, maybe something sacred, and then they vanished. For over 1,200 years, the sands kept their secret, until modern eyes with drones, scanners, and gentle brushes finally reopened the chapter. The Salme ship burials, as they are now known, stand as the earliest physical evidence of Scandinavian warriors operating in coordinated groups outside their homeland. Not just one lost soul, not just a drifting crew, a unit, with structure, command, and purpose. They had traveled across the sea, fought, died, and were laid to rest together, Not by accident, but by design. This was not raiding, it was expedition, and that changes everything. Because if the Viking Age began in 793, then this moment, this burial, was the first heartbeat of something much larger. A signal in the sand, a whisper in bone, the beginning of a storm gathering strength across the north. Before the chronicles, before the monks cried out in horror, before the sails filled the horizon, there were 40 men in 2 ships, and a silence so deep only the dead could break it. They don't teach you this in school, but maybe they should. The wind had teeth that year. It bit through the walls of longhouses, howled through smoke holes, and wrapped itself around every starving breath. It was the worst winter in living memory, and spring brought no salvation. The ice melted, but the hunger remained. On the edge of a frozen farmstead in what we now call Sweden, a man named Svine Tovsen sat by a dying hearth. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The silence in the room told the story better than words ever could. 2 of his 5 children had died before the snow thawed. His parents were buried behind the house. Their last cow, butchered too soon, had fed the family for barely a week, and what little was left had spoiled before it could be preserved. They were out of options, and the next winter would come, whether they were ready or not. Behind him, his wife Freyas rocked their youngest, her eyes hollow, voice barely a whisper. "The child needs food." Sveen didn't reply. Not yet, not until dawn, because when the sun rose, he would face a truth he'd been avoiding all winter. He would have to choose between dying here or risking everything out there. And he wasn't alone. Across the fjords, through the valleys, in longhouses built of rotting timber and failing courage, thousands of men like Sveen were coming to the same conclusion. Farming was failing them. The soil was thin, the growing season too short, their gods silent, their leaders weak, and worst of all, their children hungry. But they still had one thing. They had the sea. The Scandinavians had always been seafarers, not explorers, not yet, but fishers, traders, and travelers. They understood the coastlines like they understood their own scars. They built ships that could glide through shallow waters and dance over waves. They trained their sons to handle an oar before they could swing a sword. And now, when the land betrayed them, the sea began to whisper. Go, not out of greed, not yet out of conquest, but out of desperation. Because what do you do when your family is starving? When your leaders offer nothing, when the land beneath your feet gives no more? You build a ship, you sharpen your axe, and you sail. Sveen's son Halfdan was only 16, but already taller than his father, with the strength of a man and the hunger of someone who had seen too much too soon. "You're thinking about it again," Halfdan said one morning, as the embers burned low. Sveen nodded. Bjorn Ironside sailed east last year, came back with silver, amber, even a cow fat enough to birth twins. He lost 2 ships, but not to battle, to storms. The gods favor him. Halfdan's voice was steady. The gods favor those who act. Later that day, Frias confronted him. "You would leave us?" "No," Sveen replied. "I would save us." And that's what it was. Not abandonment, not in their eyes. These men weren't glory seekers. They were fathers, brothers, sons, standing at the edge of extinction. One voyage, just one successful journey, could bring back enough to rebuild. Livestock, tools, even land. And if it failed, then at least they'd fall chasing survival, not waiting for death to knock politely on the door. This wasn't just Sveen's story. It was a shared ache across the north. Climate was changing. Politics were shifting. Local chieftains, once powerful through generosity, could no longer feed their followers. The gift-giving feasts dried up. The mead halls were silent. The young had no path upward, no wealth to win, no battles to fight, no songs to earn their names. But the sea was open. To the east, the lands of the Slavs and Finns shimmered with trade. To the south, rumors of Christian gold and weak defenses. And to the west, whispers of monasteries filled with silver and guarded by prayers alone. So they built. In hidden fjords and under falling snow, they cut oak from ancient forests, hammered iron into nails, wove sails in winter by firelight. Every ship was a gamble, every voyage a final bet. They didn't call themselves Vikings. Not yet. They were just men, with nothing left to lose. And that perhaps made them more dangerous than anything that came after. Long before swords were drawn, before monasteries burned, before the word Viking was whispered in fear, there was the ship. And not just any ship. It began with oak, tall, proud, ancient. A tree that had stood for over 100 winters, now felled by hands that knew exactly what they needed. The right bend, the perfect grain, a future carved from the flesh of the forest. In a small cove half buried in snow, a man named Gudmund, a master shipwright, ran his hand along the keel of a vessel he had worked on all winter. His fingers were curled from decades of labor, but his eye missed nothing. "She'll ride the water like a leaf in spring," he murmured, his voice rough as timber. Standing beside him was Bjorn Ironside, not yet a legend, but already a name that carried weight. He didn't speak often, but when he did, men listened. "How many will she carry?" Bjorn asked, studying the skeleton of oak rising from the ground like the ribs of a slumbering beast. 40 men, gear and grain, axes, spears, shields, room for loot if Odin favors us. But this ship was more than wood and nails. It was freedom, it was force, it was future. What Gudmund was building was unlike anything in Christendom. While the Franks lumbered across rivers with slow, heavy craft and the Byzantines relied on hulking war galleys, the North had birthed something else entirely, something alive. It was long, narrow, shallow. A vessel that could ride the sea, then slip into a river like a whisper. It needed neither port nor permission. It could beach anywhere and leave just as fast. It was called a shalong ship, and it would change the world. The secret? A technique called clinker building. Each plank overlapped the next, like scales on a serpent. The result? A ship that was light, flexible, fast, able to bend with the waves rather than fight them. Its keel, a single piece of seasoned oak, was its spine, strong, unyielding, the soul of the ship. Gudmund had paid a silver arm ring just to harvest it from the king's forest, a small fortune, but worth every coin. Even the sail was a marvel, woven by women through the long, dark months, layered wool, treated with horse fat to repel water and catch the faintest wind. Red and white stripes, some said, not for beauty, but so enemies would see them coming and tremble. But the most terrifying part? It didn't need wind. When the breeze failed, when stealth was more valuable than speed, 40 men could take up oars and become the storm themselves. They didn't wait for nature. They conquered it. Imagine it. A quiet morning on the English coast, a mist hugging the shoreline, and then, faintly, the beat of oars, a ripple on the tide, and from the fog, a dragon's head breaks the horizon. Not a myth, not a monster, but something worse, a crew of hungry men in a ship that doesn't stop. That was the real revolution. The ship gave them reach, and reach is power, because now the boundaries of survival expanded. They were no longer trapped by their land, no longer chained to their fjords or bound by the limits of their soil. With a ship, they could go anywhere, trade, raid, explore, escape. From the rivers of Russia to the coasts of Ireland, from the Black Sea to the Northern Ice, the long ship carried more than warriors. It carried ambition. And like all things born of desperation, it was both beautiful and deadly. But these ships were not cheap. They were community investments. Dozens of trees, weeks of a blacksmith's time just to forge the iron rivets, an entire village's textile effort for the sail. They were not made on impulse. They were built with purpose, planned, funded, shared. That's what makes the early Viking voyages so remarkable. They weren't random acts of violence. They were coordinated operations with logistics, command, strategy. These weren't pirates. They were something new, something Europe never seen. Mobile, unpredictable, lethal, and all of it made possible by wood, iron, wool, and will. Gudmund ran his hand one last time along the curve of the hull. "She's ready," he said, stepping back. Bjorn nodded. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. Because soon the world would see her coming, and it would never be the same again. They didn't come looking for war. Not this time. Their ship slid onto the Estonian shore under a gray dawn sky, sails furled, oars silent. 3 vessels carrying 90 men. Not raiders. Not yet. They came to trade, to explore, maybe even to form alliances. But fate rarely honors intentions. Halfdan, now 18 and hardened by a long winter and a longer hunger, stood at the prow of his father's ship. His eyes scanned the shoreline, wooded, narrow, but with a natural harbor tucked behind a headland, perfect for a temporary camp. Svein, his father, pointed. "There, we land, we scout, no weapons drawn unless they are." They'd made this journey before, across the Baltic, through wind, sleet, and the ever-present threat of storm. They brought amber, iron blades, honey, carved combs, and stories that opened doors where blades would close them, The locals, Finnic tribes, Slavs, they weren't enemies, not yet. They were others. Mysterious, sometimes wary, sometimes curious, but always watching. 2 days after they landed, a delegation arrived. Warriors, quiet, eyes sharp. They spoke through a translator, a grizzled old man who had spent a season among the Northmen. Trade was possible, they said, but on their terms, no more than 10 men in the settlement at once. No shields, no swords, Svein agreed, cautious, respectful. That night the men laughed quietly around a smoky fire. Halfdan carved runes into a bone with his knife. The mood was light. This could work. But on the third day, something changed. The local chieftain, a man whose name would be forgotten by history but whose actions would echo, demanded more silver, more goods. Passage through his land would now come with a new price, their pride. Svein refused, not loudly, not angrily, just firmly. No man taxes me for standing on open earth. The chieftain left without a word. And the next morning, the arrows came, from the trees, from the mist, from betrayal. Halfdan heard the scream before he saw the blood. One of the guards, skewered through the neck, collapsed without a sound. Then the forest exploded. Spears, war cries, chaos. The Northmen scrambled for their weapons, some still sheathed, some still packed. This wasn't a fair fight. It wasn't meant to be. But what they lacked in preparation, they made up for in fury. Halfdan drove his axe into the chest of a man twice his size. He turned in time to see his cousin fall, skull split open like a cracked egg. His father roared somewhere behind him, a sound he would remember for the rest of his life, like thunder through bone. The fighting was brutal, close, dirty, no formations, no orders, just survival, and when it was over, blood soaked the sand. 18 men lay dead. 7 more would die before the week was out from infection and wounds too deep to treat. Only 12 stood when the sun finally broke through the clouds. Svein collapsed to his knees beside the body of Thorvald, his childhood friend. The man's hands were nearly severed, trying to block a blade that still found his heart. He killed 2 of them after this, Halfdan whispered, before he fell. They could have fled. They should have fled, but they didn't. Instead, they buried their dead, in the very ships that had carried them across the sea, in soil not their own. Because honor was not a word, it was action. The work was slow, painful, risky, but sacred. They placed the fallen with care, leaders in the center, weapons beside hands, food, tools, even gaming pieces for the journey to the next world. When they had no more strength, they dug deeper. They dragged the ships further inland, covered them with earth, marked the mounds with stones, and when they were done, they stood in silence. "Will anyone remember them?" one of the younger warriors asked. Thorgrim the Old, bleeding from a gash across his ribs, eyes red with grief, answered without turning. "The skalds will sing, their kin will pour mead in their names, and someday others will find this place, and know that we came this far, that we fought, and that we honored our dead." He was right. More than 1,200 years later, archaeologists would uncover those very ships. See the wounds still carved into bone, square holes from axes, severed wrists, decapitations, violence frozen in time. But they'd also find care, ritual, memory. The first blood of the Viking Age wasn't spilled for conquest. It was spilled for survival, for respect, for a line that could not be crossed without consequence. And though no chronicle recorded that battle, its legacy would live on, in whispers, in wounds, in wood turned to soil. This was not just a fight, it was a beginning. Victory brings silver, but survival brings story. And in the north, stories are power. By the time Bjorn Ironside returned from his 6th expedition, he no longer needed to tell his own. Others did it for him, around fires, in long houses, from drunken mouths of old warriors and eager lips of young boys who dreamed of holding a sword. He had faced Slavic warlords in the east, outran storms on the Baltic, traded iron for furs, and taken silver when trade failed. He had brought men home, not all, but enough, and with them, riches, enough to feed families, forge new weapons, build more ships. And with those ships came more men, and with more men came power. At first, he was just another son of a fading chieftain, respected but replaceable. But out there, across the waves, he built something no inheritance could offer. Authority earned in foreign waters under foreign blades. He stood now before his people, not as a petitioner, but as a leader. Silver arm rings coiled around his thick forearms, not for decoration, but as payment, proof, promise. His cloak was dyed with color rare in the north. His sword was not forged by local hands, but by a Frankish smith, patterned steel that shimmered with the swirls of 100 folds. Behind him stood 40 men, veterans, hardened, loyal not to bloodline, but to Bjorn himself, and before him a crowd of farmers, smiths, fishermen, and warriors, waiting. The eastern routes grow crowded, he said, voice steady. Our ships are now expected, our enemies prepare. Their walls are higher, their spears sharper. They watch the rivers now. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Many had planned to follow Bjorn east, to chase his fortune, to mimic his glory. But, he continued, there are other waters. He paused. Let the silence stretch. The Christians to the west, they keep gold in their churches, silver in their monasteries, they pray instead of fight, and their gods do not answer. Silence again, then curiosity, then whispers, then fire. He was offering something new. Not just survival, not just loot, but destiny. And make no mistake, this was not reckless plundering. Bjorn was not a brute, he was a tactician. His suggestion was precise, measured, political. We trade if they trade, we fight if they resist. We take only what they cannot protect. It sounded reasonable, even just. And in that moment, the old way began to break. In the past, power in Scandinavia came from birthright, from ancestry, land, feast-giving. A chieftain was a man who could host the biggest meal, tell the best tale, and die with the most sons at his side. But Bjorn offered a new model. Earn your power abroad, then wield it at home. Go beyond the mountains, return with silver, and rule. And it worked. Across Scandinavia, others began to follow the blueprint. Young men, hungry for status, looked not to the fields, but to the horizon. Old chieftains, weakened by bad harvests, found themselves challenged not by sons, but by sailors. Power began to flow toward those who could command ships, deliver victory, and return with plunder or profit. Political authority shifted from static lands to mobile steel, and with power came ritual. Bjorn knew he needed more than wealth. He needed legitimacy, so he turned to the gods. Under the full moon, he summoned the 5 districts that bordered his land. Their leaders came, some curious, some wary. They gathered in a sacred grove where the trees whispered old names and the ground remembered old blood. Bjorn brought 9 horses, 9 cattle, 9 hogs. He sacrificed them all. The blood was caught in ceremonial bowls, then sprinkled on the gathered crowd with a hallowed branch, linking them through blood, soil, and belief. The meat would be cooked and shared. A feast, yes, but also a covenant. Odin, Bjorn intoned, raising a spear carved with runes, grant us wisdom to rule, strength to sail, and the cunning to strike before we are seen. It was not just a prayer, it was a signal. A new order was rising. This ritual, and others like it across the north, marked the beginning of regional kingship, a shift from scattered clans to consolidated command. And the men who led these transformations were not born kings. They were made. In salt, in fire, in blood. Power was no longer inherited. It was seized by those who dared. And the stories, they followed. Skalds sang of brave voyages, clever raids, heroic deaths, but behind every verse was a truth darker and more enduring. Glory fades, but power remains. They had their gods, Odin the All-Father, wise in war and death, Thor the Thunderer, breaker of giants, Freya of the harvest, Njord of the seas, gods who demanded strength, gods who answered with storms, not silence. And then came another, not in flesh, but in crosses, books, and fire. To the south, the Christian world was rising, not with axes, but with absolution, not with ships, but with scripture, and in its shadow, kingdoms fell. It began with the Saxons. In the courts of the Frankish king Charlemagne, war had taken a new shape. Not just conquest, but conversion by the sword. Pagan temples burned, sacred groves felled, entire tribes baptized or butchered. And to the north, the message was clear. The Christian God was coming, not to trade, but to conquer. In the great hall of King Sigurd, now ruler of a wide swath of Scandinavian coast, thanks to expeditions funded by silver from abroad, the news arrived with chilling weight. The Franks have crossed the Elbe, Halfdan reported, eyes hard. They've slaughtered every Saxon chieftain who refused their god. The pillar of Irminsul was burned to the ground, whole villages forced into the river, baptized or drowned. The old king tightened his grip on his cup. This god of theirs, he said slowly, he does not ask, he demands. And in that, the Vikings saw something they understood. Power disguised as piety. A god who did not wait for offerings, but took them. But while the Christian kings expanded their reach by land, the Northmen had already found a path around their walls: the sea. Sigurd stood facing the fire. "We will not wait for their priests to come with scrolls and swords. We will strike first, not at their armies, but at their faith." A bold strategy, a dangerous one, but in it they saw opportunity. The Christian world was not united. Its wealth lay not just in castles, but in monasteries, places filled with gold and manuscripts, guarded not by soldiers, but by silence and ritual. Easy prey. And so the longships turned west. They did not attack military strongholds. They did not challenge Charlemagne to battle. They targeted the soul of Christian Europe, its holy men. It was not mindless destruction. It was message. To the Vikings, the monasteries were more than places of treasure. They were symbols of a god that threatened their way of life. A god who claimed to be the only god. A god who refused to share the heavens. And so they struck. Quietly, swiftly, with precision and fire. On the holy island of Lindisfarne, in the year 793, monks awoke to the sound of waves. Then the clash of steel. Ragnar's ships had arrived. No banners, no negotiation. Just men with axes, blades, and purpose. They moved through the monastery like a storm made flesh. Books were thrown aside, altars defiled, relics torn from their shrines. Those who resisted were cut down. Those who didn't were bound and taken. And as the sun rose over blood-soaked stone, the Northmen disappeared, back to sea, sails fat with wind and ships heavy with gold, silver, and terrified captives. The Christian world reeled. Alcuin of York, a scholar at Charlemagne's court, wrote in horror, "Never before has such terror been seen in Britain as we now suffer from a pagan race. God's church is desecrated, his servants slaughtered." But to the Vikings, it wasn't desecration. It was declaration, a warning. "We are not afraid of your God. We will not kneel. And if your heaven is guarded by men like these, then it is already lost." What the Northmen may not have realized then is that they had done more than steal treasure. They had changed history. Because Lindisfarne was not just a raid. It was a signal, a flare that lit up every monastery, kingdom, and coastal village in Europe. From Ireland to Iberia, the name Viking would now be etched into prayers, laws, and nightmares. The clash was no longer political. It was spiritual. It was cosmic. Two belief systems, two visions of the world, one rooted in honor, fate, and the gods of their ancestors, the other in salvation, submission, and the will of the one true God. And neither would back down. Not yet. Because the blood had only begun to flow. History remembers the blood. The burning churches, the screaming monks, the sails like wings of crows blotting out the dawn. But that's only half the story, because the same ships that brought terror to the west also carried honey, fur, amber, and iron to the east. The same warriors who swung axes in England sat quietly in Slavic markets weighing silver, bartering for silk. The Vikings weren't just raiders, they were connectors, and their empire wasn't built on land. It was built on water, across rivers that carved through dark forests, across seas that swallowed lesser men whole. They created a network, vast, silent, and unstoppable. It started in the east. By the mid-8th century, men like Halfdan were no longer passengers on their father's ships. They were leaders of expeditions, sailing through the Baltic, navigating the Gulf of Finland, and venturing deep into what is now Russia. They followed rivers with names few Scandinavians could pronounce: Neva, Volkhov, Dnieper. Rivers that twisted through Slavic lands down toward the riches of the Byzantine Empire and the glittering markets of the Islamic Caliphate. This wasn't conquest, it was commerce. Along the riverbanks, settlements like Staraya Ladoga and Novgorod sprang up, not Viking colonies, but hybrid worlds where Norsemen lived beside Slavs, Finns, Balts. Cultures mixed, words blended, goods flowed. The Vikings brought with them iron tools and weapons from Scandinavia, amber from the Baltic shores, walrus ivory from the frozen north, beeswax, honey, carved antler combs. And in return, they received furs thick as armor, silk from the east, spices, glassware, and steel, and most valuable of all, silver. Silver in the form of dirhams, Islamic coins stamped with Arabic script carried from Baghdad through intermediaries across the steppe, up the rivers, and into Viking hands. They didn't speak the language. They didn't need to. Silver speaks in every tongue. Archaeologists have uncovered Viking hoards buried across Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. Thousands upon thousands of dirhams, some with holes drilled through them, worn as jewelry, some hidden in fields, forgotten, or left behind by men who never returned. But with every coin, the Viking world expanded. And silver wasn't just wealth, it was infrastructure. It funded new ships, forged better weapons, built halls, bought loyalty, and with silver came kings. But trade wasn't clean. Where silver flowed, blood wasn't far behind. Not every expedition was peaceful, not every handshake ended in trust, and when diplomacy failed, axes spoke louder. Some Vikings came as merchants, others as mercenaries, hired swords in local conflicts, and still others as raiders when the cost of trading grew too high. The line between commerce and conquest was always thin, sometimes non existent. Yet, even in violence, the network grew, because for every burned village, there was another that welcomed the goods. For every lost ship, there were two more that returned laden with profit. And for every warrior who died in the east, another took his place the following spring. The Viking trade network stretched farther than any kingdom in Europe. From the cold harbors of Iceland to the vineyards of Francia, to the spice markets of Baghdad, even to the walls of Constantinople, where Viking guards, the famed Varangians, stood watch over the emperor himself. This was no longer a fringe society of farmers and fishermen. This was a maritime machine, flexible, relentless, and everywhere. And what's most astonishing, they did it without maps, without compasses, without empire. They navigated by stars, memory, and instinct, building one of the most complex, adaptive, and influential networks of the early medieval world. All from the deck of a longship. So yes, history remembers the blood, but never forget the silver. Because the Viking Age wasn't just an age of war, it was an age of movement, of connection, of commerce at the edge of a blade. And as the rivers carried their ships inland, those ships carried something greater than steel or gold. They carried transformation. It began with fog, a gray veil crawling over the Northumbrian coast. The monks of Lindisfarne woke to the scent of salt, the hush of tide. Another quiet morning, wrapped in prayer. The island monastery had stood for over a century, a beacon of Christian faith in a still pagan world, home to sacred relics, ancient manuscripts, the bones of St. Cuthbert, and silence, until the sails came, longships, black against the mist, carving through the stillness like knives through cloth. No horns, no warnings, just the thump of oars, the creak of wood, and the glint of steel in northern hands. The monks rushed outside, confused. Were these traders? Pilgrims? The ships bore no banners, the men spoke no Latin, and by the time the truth dawned, it was too late. They came ashore like wolves, tall, wild-haired, eyes sharp with hunger and calculation. Their axes were not for chopping wood. Their swords were not for ceremony. They were not here to talk. They were here to take. The first blow fell on Brother Aldred, still clutching a book. Then the rest. Doors splintered, altars overturned, scripture ripped, trampled, soaked in blood, gold chalices seized, ivory crosses smashed. The monks screamed. Some ran, some begged, some knelt. None were spared. To the Vikings, this was not sacrilege. It was strategy. Why storm a fortress when a holy site guards itself with only hope? Why attack warriors when the faithful carry treasure and no blades? They moved through the monastery with cold precision, looted what could be carried, burned what couldn't, and when it was over, they vanished back into the sea, leaving behind smoke, silence, and legend. The year was 793. Europe would never forget it. The raid on Lindisfarne wasn't the first Viking attack, but it was the first that made the world listen, the first that was recorded, echoed, and feared. In the court of Charlemagne, scholars trembled. How could such evil reach the house of God? Asked Alcuin of York. What punishment is this that pagans defile our holiest places while God looks away? But the answer was simpler than divine judgment. This wasn't punishment. This was power. Lindisfarne had no walls, no army, no king, only gold and faith. And the Northmen, sharpened by hunger and forged by sea, had learned a truth that terrified the Christian world. Even your God cannot save you from men who do not fear him. Word spread like wildfire across Francia, Ireland, Scotland. Coastal churches fortified their gates. Monasteries buried their relics. Kings trained their sons in war. The age of peace was over. Because Lindisfarne was not a one-time storm. It was a seasonal forecast, and it had just begun. To the Vikings, the raid was a success. To the Christian world, it was an apocalypse. But in truth, it was a big beginning. A single strike that echoed across centuries, not just as violence, but as transformation. From this moment on, the Vikings were no longer a whisper from the north. They were a name, a warning, a myth, and a force that would reshape the world, one shore at a time. Lindisfarne was not the end, it was the spark. A monastery burned, a few monks slain. It could have been forgotten, but it wasn't, because fear spreads faster than fire, and in that fear a legend was born. They called them many names: Pagani, heathens, the Northmen, but one word would rise above the rest: Vikings. It wasn't just the blood, it wasn't even the silver, it was how they struck. Where armies marched in columns, the Vikings came in silence. Where kings built castles, the Vikings sailed around them. Where Europe believed in walls, the Vikings believed in waves. Their ships, sleek, fast, unstoppable, could appear anywhere, on coastlines, up rivers, deep into the heart of kingdoms thought untouchable. Paris, London, Seville, Constantinople. No city was too far, no fortress truly safe. And that was the genius of it. They weren't trying to hold land. They weren't trying to conquer in the old way. They came for what they wanted and left before the banners were even raised. By the mid-9th century, Viking raids had become something more: a system. Spring, sail; summer, strike; autumn, return with gold; winter, build, feast, prepare to do it again. They weren't just warriors, they were entrepreneurs of fear. And fear is a currency. Kings who couldn't stop them paid them. Villages who couldn't fight them served them. And in the shadows of firelit halls, children whispered their names like curses. If you misbehave, old mothers warned, the Vikings will come for you. The church called them godless, but many secretly envied them, their freedom, their bravery, their refusal to kneel. In truth, the Vikings had something Europe had lost: momentum. Where Christian kings argued over doctrine and inheritance, the Vikings acted. Where others built borders, they built ships. Where others feared death, the Vikings welcomed it, as long as it was glorious. To die with a sword in hand was not tragedy, it was passage. To Valhalla, to song, to legend. And as their victories grew, so did the stories, some true, some stretched by the mouths of terrified survivors, that they could speak to ravens, that their berserkers fought in animal skins immune to pain, that their gods walked beside them in battle, that their ships sailed on land, gliding over fields and dragging doom with them. Fear twisted into myth, and myth hardened into reputation. Even the bravest knights hesitated at the mention of Norse sails. Even kings reinforced their castles at rumors of longships. Even the church began to pray, not just to God, but against the men from the sea. "Deliver us, O Lord," they wrote, "from the fury of the Northmen." But it was too late. The fury had already landed, and it was not a storm that passed. It was a new climate, a new reality, where power was measured not by land, but by reach, where kingdoms rose and fell by who controlled the rivers, where silver and steel replaced scripture and stone. This was no longer about survival. This was era. And at its center stood the Vikings, once starving farmers, now legends carved into the bones of Europe. They did not ask for a place in history. They took it. With oars, with blades, with fire, and the world would never forget their name. The sails are gone now. No more dragon-headed ships haunting the horizon, no more axe-wielding raiders chanting Odin's name in the fog. The monasteries have been rebuilt, the kingdoms reforged, and the fury of the north has faded into the wind. But listen closely, it's still there. Not in fire, not in steel, but in memory. Because the Vikings didn't vanish, they transformed, they settled, they traded, they married into royal bloodlines, they became farmers, kings, mercenaries, saints. The very kingdoms they once terrorized, England, France, Ireland, would later carry Viking blood in their veins. Names like Normandy from Northmen are living echoes of their presence. Cities like Dublin, once a Viking slave market, would rise into capitals. Even Russia, yes, the word Rus itself, many believe, came from the Viking traders who rowed their ships down the Dnieper and Volga, shaping a nation in their wake. Their language melted into others. Their myths slipped into folk tales. Their gods faded, but their courage, their restlessness, never did. Because the true Viking legacy is not just in what they took, but in what they changed. They shattered the illusion that Europe was safe behind walls. They reminded the world that the sea is not a barrier, it's a road. And they proved that even the smallest, hungriest tribe can shake an entire continent if they dare enough. But maybe the most powerful thing they left behind was the story. A story of people who had nothing, no empire, no fertile land, no mighty cities, but who refused to accept the fate given to them, who looked at an unforgiving world and said, "If the gods have no mercy, then we will carve our own path with salt and fire." And they did. For 300 years, they wrote that path in sails, smoke, and legend. And long after the last raid, long after the longships turned to rot, their spirit sails on. In our obsession with adventure, in our hunger for exploration, in our refusal to be tamed, because in every corner of the modern world, the Viking story still whispers, "You were not born to kneel, you were born to voyage." If this journey through fire, blood, and legacy stirred something inside you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. This is just one story from the shadows of history, and there are countless more waiting to be told. Because legends never die, they just wait for someone to remember them.